Good afternoon. My name is Helen Miller and I am Assistant Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym the GSSB, held on 24th May 2017. This virtual meeting is being hosted from the GRI Secretariat Office in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage along with high-level summaries of the previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Director, Standards Division, Chelsea Reinhardt, Deputy Director, Standards Division, Anna Krotova, Manager, Standards Division, Laura Espinach, Manager Standards, and Tina Nibu-Jensen, Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations. We will now start with a roll call. Mr. Daniel Tailang. Mr. Dwight Justice.
Here.
Mr. Evan Harvey.
Present.
Mrs. Julia Wilson.
Hello, here.
Mr. Jürgen Buxbaum.
Hello, I'm here.
Mr. Ken Swift.
I am here.
Mr. Michelle Washer.
Present.
Mr. Nankumar Vadakepat. Mr. Nankumar Vadakepat, are you present?
Yeah, I'm present.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, thank you.
Hello.
Mrs. Robin Leeson.
Yes, I'm here.
Mr. Stian Vandrach.
Good afternoon, present.
Mrs. Sulema Pioli.
Present.
And Mrs. Judy Kuczewski, GSSB Chair.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
We would like
Thank you very
to note,
much, Helen.
my pleasure. We would like to note that GSSB members Mr. Attila Yelikaya and Mr. Daniel Ingram, Kirsten Margrethe Hovey, and Mr. Daniel Tailang send their apologies to this meeting. I will now hand to the chair, Judy Kuczewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Helen. And welcome to everyone on the line from the GSSB membership and from the Standards Board staff, as well as any of our friends and supporters listening in online on the webcast. We have a full agenda once again today. So I would like to ask the Standards Division to move us through our slides. We have our first agenda. I would like to say that we have taken the decision to make a very small adjustment to the agenda so that right at the beginning we have an update about staffing and the work program from Bastian rather than leaving that to the any other business slot at the end of the agenda. But otherwise the agenda is as identical to what has been published. So I hope that will be okay. Our first item on the agenda is to approve the meeting minutes from the previous two GSSB meetings. You'll recall that we have had a number of discussions about the format for minutes, and I think we're still working on this. There's likely to be some adjustments further to the format of these minutes, but for the sake of being able to move forward, I would like to ask whether there are still any questions or concerns or edits to be made to these two sets of minutes, or whether we can now go ahead and publish these, confirm them. If there are no adjustments to be made, then I will take that as consensus that we are happy to approve these two sets of minutes. Again, on the proviso that we're still working on the format of these, and so the next set of minutes may look a little bit different still. But hopefully that will be work that we can accomplish pretty effectively offline. May I ask if we have been joined by another member? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard someone joining in, but that's fine. Having said all of that, why don't we move on then to the update on the staffing and work program, which Bastian is going to talk to us about. Bastian?
Yes, thank you, Judy, and I hope you can hear me clearly. We have 3 items for information during this section. First of all, we have just recently added a new team member. We will have a team assistant again. Her name is Jillian. She will join us 1st of June. So we are slowly but surely coming back to full capacity of the team. I'm mentioning this because she is likely going to be in touch with you also with follow-up discussions and so on. So we will introduce her by email to you as well. But it took a while to find the right candidate, but we're very, very happy to have her on board, and she will join us as of next week. Second item is about the future staffing situation, and we had shared in February that we have started to recruit for the sector program. Specifically, we had advertisements out for 2 positions, a deputy director for the sector program as well as a manager for the sector program. In the first round of recruitment, we actually failed to identify a qualified candidate for the deputy director and have put the recruitment for the manager on hold, because we had the idea that first we would hire in a deputy director. And we have just recently reposted the deputy director post again. In the last weeks, there has been a new development, or basically a confirmation from the GRI Secretariat that as part of the budget planning, we have put we will put the sector program hiring on hold for now, and that is because we're looking at an 18-month time window for the next budget of GRI, and we want to be sure that we can fund the sector program as outlined by the GSSB in full capacity, and that is currently still under discussion whether we have the funds available as of the beginning of the next financial year, that is 1st of July 2017. So for now, this recruitment has been put on hold, and we will repost as soon as funding becomes available. Should you have had interested people contacting you about the sector program deputy director post, please forward their emails to me, and I can reach out to them, explain the situation, but also keep them on file, so once we start hiring for the program, then we can actually reach out to them and inform them that the post is available again. A last item relates to the overall budgeting cycle that GRI has and the current budget preparations for the next financial year. We have scheduled for today a number of project approvals, and these, in particular, the one on human rights, as well as on the economic category, the numerous economic standards that we're looking at. These are potentially quite involved projects, especially in the second phase. So it is prudent to mention at this stage that we are awaiting a budget allocation for the next financial year. This will be discussed between Judy, myself, the Chief Executive of GRI, Timon, and the Chair of the GRI Board, Christy Woods, as well as the Chairperson of the Finance and Remuneration Committee of GRI, and this will happen end of June. So we will await more information on the exact budget allocation, and the Standards Division together with Judy will then draw up project plans that are reflective of the funds that we have available and the capacity we can apply to the projects that we're discussing during the call today. I'm mentioning that to flag to you that there is not necessarily an automatism in terms of immediately starting the projects in the full glory. But we might have to stage elements of the projects. And that is for two reasons. Obviously, and you see that in the project proposals, there are technical reasons that certain discussions have to be developed. Scope of projects has to be discussed in technical committees, but also there's a funding component to it and the capacity that we can apply to these projects. We will have more news for you, if not in the June call, then the latest in the July call. But at this stage, I wanted to mention this to all of you so that when approving the project proposals later today, you are aware that there is capacity still to be hired in, and the confirmation also of funding to enable us to do that is pending with the overall GI budgeting process. I think I leave it at that for the staffing and work program discussion. As part of the next meeting, we will also provide an update on the last launch events that the Standards Division has participated in. We have currently a number of launch events still pending, in particular in Latin America, over the coming weeks, and one in Taiwan, and we will then report back on that work program element as well. Judy, back to you.
Thank you, Bastian. Can I ask whether there are any immediate questions for clarification, which we might attempt to answer at this point, just on the understanding that this is very much a live conversation. Would the members of the Standards Board like to raise any immediate discussion points on this that need to be taken on board while we have these conversations over the coming weeks? Okay, I don't know if, as I don't have access to the webinar interface today, I can't tell whether there are any comments in the chat function. I'll rely on the Secretariat to advise me whether there's anything that comes up. But otherwise, hearing none, thank you for that update, Bastian, and I'm sure we'll all look forward to coming back to that discussion shortly. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is to discuss and approve the draft project proposal for the review of GRI 201, 202, and 203 standards. Would Chelsea, I believe I might be handing that to you. Would you like to take that up?
Thank you, Judy. So we have the next three sections. We will go through one by one the project proposal for the review of the economic related standards, the tax disclosures project, and then I will turn it over to Lara for the proposal on human rights. For each of these, what we're going to do is to summarize the updates since the last GSSB conversation in April. We'll give you a summary of the changes that we've made to the project proposals, and then we will ask for the GSSB to discuss and approve the project proposal, and of course that can be subject to any amendments or changes that you suggest during the call. And after we go through the approval of the project proposal, then we will have a brief discussion on each one about the comments received from board and stakeholder council, as well as implications for moving those projects ahead and forming technical committees. So we wanted to detach a little bit the project proposal element of that from what comes next and who will need to be involved in actually getting that up and off the ground. So with that, following the April GSSB meeting, Musarat Hossain, who's a relatively new coordinator who's joined our team in the Standards Division, and myself have been very busy on the phone with a number of organizations related both to economic performance as well as the tax disclosure work. We have been continuing to carry out scoping calls with relevant organizations or individuals. And really for this project, we are trying to find the right areas of expertise in developing and applying frameworks or methodologies for measuring organizations' impacts on local economies. And we'll talk a bit more about what we found later on and what that means for the technical committee. We have made slight revisions to the project proposal based on feedback from the GSSB in April, as well as a couple of comments from the Stakeholder Council and the GRI board received. And those are outlined for you in item 03, lines 20 to 31. So that includes some minor wording changes recommended by the GSSB around fair wages, adjusted to wages and compensation. We've expanded slightly the list of potential topics that could be included in this review. And again, that's just a starting point that is subject to change as we actually start the work in the next few months. We've added a reference to the UN guiding principles along with the existing reference to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And we've also made another reference to economic impact assessment tools used by development finance institutions and state-owned enterprises to our existing paragraph that references some existing methodologies in this area. So those are outlined for you in item 03. And we also had very kindly Michel Washer volunteered to serve as the GSSB sponsor for this project. So we thank him kindly and welcome him on board. If anyone else is interested in co-sponsoring, you're also very welcome to get in touch with us, but we're very happy to confirm that from our end. Just at a high level, a summary of the comments that we received. So as per due process, all of these project proposals were shared with the GRI Stakeholder Council and the board for their input, and that input is then to be considered by the GSSB, although you're not required to follow it by the due process. And in each of these project proposals received ahead of the meeting, you have in the annex a summary of the comments received from the Stakeholder Council and the board. Overall, we had very good support for this project, so there is really an acknowledgement that this is an area that GRI and the GSSB should work on. We also are potentially going to need to look at expanding the scope from the 3 standards already included to also potentially include our procurement practices and employment standard, because feedback we've had already, not only from the Stakeholder Council, but from subject experts we've talked to, is that these areas are intrinsically linked, and we can't really talk about the way that an organization is impacting on local economies without looking at, for example, the types of jobs that they're creating, and not just how many jobs, but what kind of jobs those are, and similarly with their procurement strategies. So it may be that one of the first decision points for a subsequent technical committee will be to look at how the scope of that project may need to be adjusted, and we have acknowledged that already in the project proposal. There were a number of suggestions to include additional concepts within the broad category of areas that might be included, such as, for example, shared value, the impacts of digitalization, environmental taxes, and economic impacts as related to human rights. So right now we have quite a long laundry list of potential subject areas, of which the technical committee would need to do some filtering, certainly. Good support for aligning the project with both the expectations in the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles, but also really strong support for making connections between this project and the work that GRI and others are doing on trying to help organizations demonstrate their contributions to the SDGs. Overall, we had very few concrete suggestions for organizations or individuals to actually be a part of the technical committee. That's very different than what we've had both in tax and human rights. So what we are in the process of right now is really trying to track down relevant expertise or related methodologies that we could draw upon. But I think it's very unlikely that we will find a set of metrics that GRI could directly adopt or build off of. I think there is certainly room for GRI to take a bit of a pioneering role here in creating new or potentially reimagined disclosures based on existing frameworks, but not drawing upon any of them specifically. So that, I think, is both exciting for us, but also means that this will likely take a bit more time to put together the right group to do the work. So with that, before we talk a bit more about suggestions from the GSSB around the technical committee elements, I would ask back to you, Judy, to see whether or not the board is happy to approve the project proposal as it stands so that we could formalize this as a project, or whether there are any suggested changes or amendments.
Okay, thank you. So having discussed this in a couple of forms and taken some feedback on it and made a few adjustments to it already, I would like to ask for the Standards Board's approval of this project proposal. May I ask for any queries or objections or concerns? Okay, hearing none. Chelsea, I
Hello?
think that means this is...
Sorry.
Hello,
Judy?
yes?
This is Sulema.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi.
I'd like to make just 2 comments. In some extent, I'm comfortable with the proposal, but I would like to highlight the need to avoid overlap with social impacts, it's very common in terms of dealing with economic impacts. The concept of shared value, it's being applied by IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, for a while. And in some extent, it's being applied when the economic impact of their investment in projects in Latin America is generating positive economic impacts. So I'm comfortable with the inclusion of this type of concept, but we need to also focus on negative impacts. The other thing that I need to highlight, I'm not sure about the response for this doubt or question, but we should avoid to overlap with social impacts. Otherwise, it will be a mess to the reporters to find out the difference between reporting on their economic impacts and reporting on their social impacts. So, for example, in the lines 81 and 82, there are some examples on impacts on poverty alleviation. They are more related with social impacts rather than exclusively or directly linked with economic impacts. I'm happy to help the Standard Division to brainstorming about the scope of the proposal if it's suitable.
Okay, thank you, Sulema. I think those concerns are duly noted. It is a very fine line sometimes between the economic and the social categories. Chelsea, any immediate response?
I think it's a very valid point, and I also think your point is very valid, Judy, in that a lot of these areas are, I mean, we knew this when we went through the categorization last year across our own topics, that we've started actually in scoping calls referring to these as socioeconomic in some cases because the areas are so gray. But I think certainly that is one thing that we can call out within the terms of reference for the technical committee very clearly, that although we acknowledge there's overlap, the primary focus really should be on not replicating work that already exists within the social impact assessment space. But I expect that the GSSB will have a series of subsequent conversations on this once draft recommendations come out of that committee to see what we feel comfortable putting into the economic category, and there might also be implications that come out that will affect things that currently sit within our social disclosures but are still meaningful contributions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think this conversation is probably to be continued as the work unfolds, but can we please make a note to keep the concerns that Sulema has raised in mind as we scope out of the project and as we get the work underway. Are we otherwise, GSSB members, are we otherwise happy to approve the project proposal?
Sorry, there's one comment from Dwight. He's got his hand up on the chat.
Okay, thank you, Dwight.
I'll be really brief because, but I cannot let this discussion go by without offering something very quotable, which was about the difference between economic and social development. And the difference, it seems, is only a matter of the mind, and only then a mind that has received years of academic training. But you really can't separate the two. But I think we do need to make a distinction between the economic and the social, but we have to keep in mind that all of the dimensions of sustainable development are in the end dimensions about the same thing, and there's a high degree of interdependency and interrelationships. But I think we need to sort of just bear that in mind and go ahead the way we're planning.
Thank you, Dwight.
Judy, this is Sulem again. Can I make a last remark on this? My main concern it's about precision and how to lead the reporters to better report on their initiatives in contributions to economic and social development. Because sometimes some contributions to economic development are not generating social development, and the other way around, it occurs the same. Sometimes when putting money on training programs, trying to raise social development, it could not generate economic development. This is the case here in Brazil. We are spending a lot of money, business are spending a lot of money on training people, and there are no jobs, there are no opportunities for improve their ability to generate income. So I really, my remark is, we should be very precise in terms of guiding reporters on reporting economic and social impacts and development.
I think that is a sentiment that is widely shared by your fellow GSSB members, and the trick will be to keep those principles in mind as we start dealing with the reality of it when we go into the depths on the standards revisions.
So my last suggestion would be the same that I've made to the human rights revision. Why not to ask for reporters why they are not, or what would be the hurdles or obstacles to report their economic impacts?
I'm sure that something along those lines is part of the research that will be going into feeding the discussion for the working group. If I'm not right about that, then I certainly agree that should be part of the information that will help to get that discussion going and to inform what needs to be done with the standards in the future.
So, Judy, just a quick comeback on that from our end. We haven't actually scoped specific research with groups of reporting companies about their economic impacts, because one of the things that we're finding is that there is not a lot of awareness of what they should be reporting on for their economic impacts above and beyond the elements that are already in the GRI standards. So we have done some initial research about how our current disclosures are being reported, but I think maybe we would need to take offline with Selema to understand the added value or the specific research questions that we are trying to answer with that, because all of those research components are resource intensive for us, and we're very happy to do them, but we need to understand clearly what's the outcome that will be brought back into the project work.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. And it does sound to me like we're getting into some of the detail that kind of would tend to preempt the working group conversation per se. So I would like to bring the approval of the project proposal to a conclusion. I think my sense is that we're there, but until I'm able to say that the Standards Board does not have any objections to the finalization of this proposal, then we will stay here until that time is done. Is there any final?
Yeah,
yes,
Judy,
please.
this is Tina from the GRI Secretariat. Michel has raised his hand.
Okay, thank you. Michel.
Yes, hello. It's just a short comment. Effectively, the boundary between economic performance, social performance, or environmental performance can be a bit gray. I mean, if you use economic indicators like environmental provisions, is it in economic performance or is it in environmental performance? But I think we can just draw the attention of the working group precisely on that topic and say that it's part of their job to issue a recommendation on where exactly is the boundary, where it should be set.
That sounds like a wise suggestion. Okay, acknowledging all of this discussion and all of these very good suggestions, can we then move on in the discussion here and therefore approve the project proposal? Any further amendments required? Okay, hearing none.
Judy.
Oh, sorry. You're happy, Stian?
Yep.
Very good. Okay. Thank you very much. So, Chelsea, I think we have consensus on that. Would you please carry on with the further discussion?
Sure. So the next is really to put this back for the board. So we you'll see later in today's meeting, we'll talk about the extensive suggestions that we've had for contributions to the technical committees for tax and human rights. We are still in scoping calls on this work to figure out the most relevant organizations and methodologies out there. To summarize a lot of the conversations we've had so far, they show great interest and enthusiasm for this work area and acknowledge that it's a really good area where metrics need to be further developed. But they don't have a lot of concrete suggestions for frameworks that GRI should be drawing upon or specific approaches that would be directly relevant to what we're trying to do here. So back to my initial point that I think we have quite a bit of interesting pioneering work to do underneath the remit of this project, but we will need internally a bit more time to bring back to the GSSB a proposed set of viewpoints or organizations to be considered within the technical committee. So we hope to have that ready for you for an initial discussion next month, but in the interim time, if you come across or you have ideas or colleagues that you think would be relevant for us to speak with, please do send them to myself or Musarat, and we will continue working on that over the next few weeks.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Chelsea. I think that probably then brings us right on to the next topic, which is to discuss and approve the draft project proposal for tax and payments to governments.
Can I please ask, Jürgen speaking, do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Please go ahead.
Can I please ask, Chelsea, in your proposal on the technical committee, does it mean that exactly 5 persons would be members of the technical committee? And second, how would the working relationship in very practical terms be between the technical committee and the experts and interested parties that you are suggesting building a circle around the committee? How would that look like in practice very, very concretely?
So we haven't actually gotten there in the presentation. I think you're jumping ahead of us slightly, Jürgen, which is fine.
Well, I'm sorry. You are right. Yes. We're just approving the. Sorry, I leave it for later. Yes.
Those are good questions, and now I will seek to answer them as I go through the next section. But yes, if you're willing, I will carry on, and then we'll come back to those. No, they're very good questions. Right, so switching gears and looking at tax, this area has been very different to explore as opposed to economic performance. We're finding that lots of organizations are interested in working on tax transparency. I mean, lots of them. And we are now at the point where we're going to have to start curtailing the initial scoping calls we've had because we could just do nothing else. And it's all quite interesting. There's a lot of interest in GRI's role in this space because a number of organizations, both in the investor side, civil society, and elsewhere, are interested in promoting the agenda of tax transparency and don't have yet a really good vehicle to do that. And I think a lot of conversations that we've had, people are really looking at GRI's work in this space as being a very positive step forward in terms of voluntary reporting on tax. So we also have some expectation management that we will have to do as we move forward with this project. So we have on this slide a list of organizations that we've already talked with or are in the process of talking to. I would say we have conversations scheduled tomorrow. I'll speak with Unilever, and later in June I'll speak with Vodafone, and these are the two companies, the two together with Sab Miller, the only 3 companies in the world that have been pointed out to us as really being leaders in the voluntary tax disclosure space. And we have had interest from their senior tax transparency teams in all organizations to speak with us, which is really positive. We've had lots of interest from the investor community. So UNPRI has a task force on tax disclosure. We've spoken to a number of individual investors as well as data aggregators or ratings agencies such as MSCI, Rebecca-Sam, and others. So we could fill a technical committee several times over, in short, if we wanted to. We have made, before we go into the technical committee details too much, though, I'll take a step back and come back to the project proposal. So we've made some slight revisions to this based on feedback from the GSSB last month, and those changes are outlined in item 04 on lines 20 to 30. We've added an additional sentence around the project objectives to give a bit more detail around the aim of this work, and we've also added another bullet point under the scope of recommendations for the technical committee, referring to the additional contextual information that they think will be necessary to understand any disclosures related to tax or payments to government. And with those two amendments, we're putting the proposal forward for approval, and we also would like to thank Ken Swift for volunteering to serve as the sponsor for this work, which is fantastic. And again, if anyone else is interested in being a co-sponsor, please also get in touch. Very short summary of comments we've received. Generally very good support for GRI to launch this project, although we had a couple of stakeholder council members pointing out that it is likely to be controversial, particularly with the US business sector. The fact that it's really going to be critical for us to have the right technical or tax accounting expertise in this group, so this will be a technical committee, in order to understand the nuance of different accounting and reporting methods. So we need to balance both information users who would need to understand really what companies are reporting with those who understand the differences and the overlaps between existing accounting techniques and also reporting frameworks that exist out there. So we've been in several conversations recently that are slightly over our heads in terms of tax accounting expertise, although we are trying to learn quickly from GRI's end. Alignment with other efforts has been something that's been pointed out as being important to consider. So that's including the OECD Base Erosion and Profit Sharing, or BEPS initiative, as well as the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative. But the degree to which there's going to be direct overlap in what GRI is looking to do around tax disclosure versus what these initiatives are looking to do still remains to be seen. So for example, the BEPS is about reporting to tax authorities, and the information that you might want a company to share with the tax authorities, depending who you speak to, could be quite different from what you're going to ask them to put out in the public domain. So there's further work to be done to really understand these relationships, but we certainly acknowledge that maintaining touch points with similar reporting frameworks or initiatives will be important. And then, yeah, we did have lots of suggestions for organizations to participate in this work going forward. So we'll come back to the technical committee structure and viewpoints in a few minutes. But first, maybe, Judy, I will just turn it over to you to focus first on the proposal as it stands.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Okay, with all of that sort of update and summary, can I ask the Standards Board for their approval of the project proposal? Any objections or questions that need to be addressed before we can do so?
Judy, this is Sulema.
Yes.
It's just a highlight regarding the lines 96 to 98, because we are talking about reporting on the payments to the governments, tax payments and others. And some, as far as I know, here in Latin America, there is no control from business on where this money will be allocated. So I would take care about the language around the linkage between tax and socio-economic development, because the control of the money it's made by the state or the government, not by the business. So we are seeking for transparency from business, right? but the direct linkage between where the money will be allocated, it's not under the control of the business in general.
No.
So I
No.
just want to highlight how careful we should be when using this type of linkage when writing down or when revising the standards or when writing down the new standards about taxes.
Mm. Okay, thank you for that. Yes, that is one of the things that makes this topic a bit tricky and a bit different for GRI as well.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Any other comments, thoughts, concerns?
Judy, this is Julia. No concerns or objections for me. I would just be interested to hear what comes out of the conversations with Vodafone and Unilever, both for my own edification, and I think it could be an opportunity for GRI perhaps to put together some kind of communication in cooperation with Unilever and Vodafone, and maybe it's something that could be sort of seeded early and shared and something that could start a conversation and perhaps get others to share viewpoints or share, particularly, recognizing the concerns that the Stakeholder Council brought up about the U.S. business community. I think highlighting or sharing Unilever and Vodafone's process around this at a high level could launch a conversation that might give helpful feedback to GRI from unexpected places, perhaps.
Thank you. Good point. Chelsea, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Julia. I think let us have those conversations, and then we will be more than happy to share a synopsis of that with you and any other interested board members. And then we would also, I think that's a great suggestion to see how we can maybe think about putting together a position statement or an endorsement or something that would help engage more interest and support from the business community as well.
Okay,
Judy, we had one comment from Nand Kumar about how he questioning how the tax payment to government will be selected as a material topic. So in his view, tax payment to government is part of governance. Should we not add this as part of governance? And as he's in a public area, he has put that in through the chat.
Fair enough. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we don't yet. Correct me if I misunderstand this, Chelsea. But I think we don't yet have a view as to exactly where and how any recommendations that come out of this technical committee might actually be taken up in either current, revisions to current standards or future standards. Mm-hmm. So that, to my mind, is still a very much open question, and I think that Nand Kumar's suggestion could very well be what comes to pass. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, that's correct. We have actually explicitly asked the technical committee or we will ask, but it's in the project proposal to ask for implications on what it would mean to put disclosures on tax in different places. So actually, I could probably think of examples where tax might be a material issue because we have a lot of stakeholder concern and awareness around this, particularly for big multinationals or those who are operating in traditional tax haven companies. At the same point, there may be disclosures that would eventually sit in these sort of universal standards because they are universally applicable and they deal with things like governance or strategy on tax or oversight. So I think that will remain to be seen, but those are very good points to note.
Thank you. Right. I think we might again be edging towards consensus on approving this project proposal. Any other final comments or questions? We will obviously still go on to discuss a little bit further the detail in the work going forward for this technical committee. But as far as the project proposal is concerned, I think we may have consensus on this. Please, if that's not the case, would you speak up now?
Judy,
okay, great.
I certainly support it, and
thank you very much, Stian. That's very helpful. and we will we will assume the approval and the support of the rest of the board as well at this point. So thank you very much for that. Chelsea, do you want to take us through the rest of the discussion about the technical committee and the workings, the structure, and all of that that still has to be done?
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, GSSB. So we had a series of suggestions for additional technical committee members that came from yourselves, the Stakeholder Council, or the GRI board. So I won't run through all of these, but they really include a mix of companies or organizations we've already been speaking with, as well as some new ones, labor groups, civil society, government-related development organizations, as well as recommendations about who within business we should be speaking with. Some of these are more regional and some are more global. What we are going to recommend to the board, but this is really up for your discussion, is that we would like to probably keep the technical committee relatively small and focused in terms of doing that initial development of draft recommendations and coming back to the GSSB with that content, but that we would like to be a bit more creative about how we engage a broader network of issue experts or interested parties as a sounding board as that work gets developed. So in the due process protocol, we have the ability to carry out roundtables or field tests, although there's not a lot of guidance offered on how to do that. We have quite a lot of leeway. But what we would like to propose for the GSSB is that we go ahead and pull together a technical committee, and we'll talk in a minute about what that might look like, but that we maintain what's now probably about 30 different people we've already spoken with or will have conversations with who have a vested interest and would like to participate in some way in giving feedback and helping to support the work that GRI is doing in this space, and that would be done in between any sort of, or ahead of any kind of public comment period that would come later. So with that notion in mind, what we have identified internally as being sort of key viewpoints to have represented within the technical committee are the following. And maybe before I come back to those, I'll just speak to you about the process we'd like to put forward in how to appoint a technical committee. This is not an area that we have spelled out clearly in the due process, and it's not something that we've done previously with the GSSB other than the employee worker committee that was formed, well, before my time at GRI and ahead of the transition to standards. So we're going to propose this process, but for your discussion as well. And the first step of that would be to have the board agree on the high-level viewpoints to be represented within that group. So what are really the key areas of controversy or different perspectives or areas of expertise that we need to make sure that we've covered? Once the GSSB has given us general agreement on that, then we would propose to go out to Judy and to the GSSB sponsor for the project to review and approve in more detail the terms of reference, which is based really on the project proposal, but also includes time commitments and timelines, as well as the proposed membership list with actual names and organizations underneath each of those categories of viewpoints or expertise. Once that has been agreed upon by the chair and the sponsor, then we would reach out to the potential members with the terms of reference and the project timeline to gauge their interest, but caveating, of course, that we would just be putting their name forward for the GSSB and that the GSSB has the decision power. And really the context around this is that we want to balance our ability to engage people and to promise them a role in this committee with actually the feasibility of having the GSSB approve their participation. So we don't want the GSSB to approve a list of names and then go back to these people and find out that they actually don't have the capacity to participate. And similarly, we don't want to go out to a set of people and say, we'd really like to invite you to join, are you interested? And then have the GSSB reject a large portion of them. So this is our proposed middle ground. Once we have a sort of commitment of general interest, then we would submit the final proposed membership to the GSSB for approval, including a summary of expertise, as well as the names and organizations of the proposed members. And at that point, then the GSSB would have a decision and either say, yes, this looks right in line with what we've looked at back to point one in terms of the high-level viewpoints, or actually we have some queries or concerns, and then we would work through those remaining individuals that might need to be changed or adjusted. So that's the process that we had discussed with Judy to put forward to the GSSB, and maybe it's worth having just a minute to get any feedback from the board on this, or to take any questions before we actually go back and look at what we would propose as high-level viewpoints for the tax technical committee.
Okay, thanks, Chelsea. Yes, so this question about the process by which a technical committee gets appointed is quite an important one. The process for reaching out to people and vetting them and sharing GRI's plans and so forth can be very laborious for the standards division to undertake. At the same time, we'll be asking people to put themselves forward and potentially to consider giving up some significant amount of time and lending their own unique expertise to our work. And so we want to be efficient, and we want to respect the interest that they show. And therefore, we've tried to come up with a process here that will enable us to have confidence that we've got the right perspectives represented on the technical committee, maintains the sort of final say with the GSSB, but makes the process as lean as we think we can make it at this point. Are there any questions, observations, recommendations that the Standards Board would like to make around this process at the moment?
Jürgen is speaking. I would just like to say I find the process as introduced now by Chelsea very convincing, logical. It's a good process. And at the same time, I would like to repeat my question. When you say, Chelsea, you would like to have the number of participants limited, what do you have in mind in concrete terms? I mean, you suggest the groups here that should be represented. Should for each group be one representative in the technical committee, or how do you see that? What's your approach?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we'll come back to that slide in a minute. At the moment, what we've come up with internally is that we'd like to keep these technical committees to under 10 people, and ideally even smaller, in order to allow them actually to work more closely together in a more flexible structure. So right now we have 15 on both project working groups for water and health and safety, and those are very large groups to convene. They're very tricky to get scheduled, and they're very tricky to allow everyone to provide enough input in the limited time that we have. So our proposal would be, ideally, we would be looking at somewhere between sort of 6 to 9 seats on those committees at the most. Now, we're finding that's hard because we've had lots of recommendations for key organizations or views to be represented, and that will require some cutting or deprioritizing and relegating some perspectives to being in that sort of second circle of interested parties and experts. But we would ask for your assistance in that if you agree with the overall approach.
Okay, thank you. And any other questions?
Dwight has a hand up. Judy?
Thank you. Dwight, yes, please.
Well, I agree with the process that's been proposed in the sense that it sets out who decides what and the order of how it's decided. And I think that's okay. I think that number one, based on Jürgen's comment, is the GSSB agrees on the viewpoints. There also might be a general agreement as to the relative weights or composition at the same time that they're agreeing on the viewpoints. But of course, I think it can be, it doesn't have to be fixed, but I think the indication can be there in any event. Now, the thing that would concern me is there's nothing in this proposal, and I am not suggesting that there should be, but it would seem to me that you would still, even though these are the decision makers and they order, you still need to consult, because if you don't consult, you might end up in a situation where after a lot of work, something's presented to the GSSB for final approval, but there's controversial items in there that weren't anticipated, and then you don't get the final approval. So I think you might want to keep in mind in this process that it isn't a secret process. You know the sponsors and the chair and this and that need to make sure that everybody's comfortable as you move ahead. But that is an informal suggestion, but it's one that would be necessary if this were to work.
Yeah, Dwight, maybe
Yeah,
just to come back to
go
that
ahead.
point quickly, I would say, maybe we take that on an exception basis. So if there are GSSB members that for a particular topic area, and I can think of some examples out of our group already, think that you as well as the project sponsor might be very interested in knowing who specifically we're putting forward as representing one of those viewpoints. So you have a very strong interest in tax and you would have strong feelings about one organization over another, then we are more than happy to share the sort of proposed membership list, maybe a bit broader than with the chair and the sponsor, to any other directly interested GSSB parties, provided that we still get that input in a reasonable time frame.
Well, again,
Yeah. Go ahead.
well, I'm not proposing to change the rules. I'm just asking people to make sure that that they're if they see something that might be a problem, that they check it out, or that before you get to a situation where everything is presented to the GSSB to the surprise of the GSSB.
Okay.
Dwight, can I ask? I'm a little unclear whether you're talking about the proposed membership of the technical committee right now, or you're talking about the contents of their conversations and any recommendations that come out of that.
I'm talking about the proposed membership list with names and organizations.
Okay, thank you. All right, fine. Okay. Any other questions or comments on
Sulema
these
has raised her
process
hand.
points? Yes, thank you, Sulema.
Yes, thank you. Just, I'm not sure if it was already said, but Chelsea, are you proposing not to have public call for the technical committee?
We are definitely proposing not to have a public call. Yeah, that is very much in the due process. It is only that the GSSB appoints technical committee members. We would like to not have a public call because what we found with water and OHS is that we did such a good job raising interest that not only did it take us a tremendous amount of time to screen through candidates, but also then we had large numbers of people who were disappointed that they weren't able to engage. And in these, because it's deliberately a technical committee as opposed to a working group, we would rather do that pre-selection based on the organizations and contacts that we already have to put forward. But that is, again, something that can be debated by the GSSB.
In principle, I do agree with the process proposed, but the thing is, are you already profiled the members, the potential members that will be invited to be part of this technical committee?
So we have a good idea already for tax and for human rights on the viewpoints that we want to have represented, and I'll give you a sense now on what that looks like for tax. For economic performance, that review, we're not there yet. I wouldn't know who. We need more time to continue carrying out scoping conversations and be pointed to different organizations.
So basically, so far you do have a clear design of the suitable profile of the potential members, right? Or you already have the names?
We have names for most of those already. But what we're looking to do for this call is to get the GSSB ideally to agree with this proposed process, which is important first, or to suggest changes, and then for tax and human rights to ideally agree on those high-level viewpoints as per number 1, and then we would be putting against that the names that, and in some cases we might have actually 2 names or organizations that could equally represent one of those viewpoints that we would discuss with Judy and with the sponsor, which candidate we might want to ask first, acknowledging that they may not have interest or availability.
Okay, so I do trust in your judgment on this, but I would highlight the need of balance. So this is only the remark that I would like to make about the process on the tax issue, because tax can be tricky, right? The technical people that are coping and dealing with taxes, it could be, how can I say, I would take care about balance, representation. This is my point.
Jürgen is speaking again. I support that very much what Suleyma is saying. It's a very controversial and political sensitive issue we are going to deal with. We need to have that really balanced established committee.
Okay. Any other comments on process before we go talk about balance of that committee? And we'll probably have to try and do that fairly briefly so I have time to hand that over as well to Lara.
I think that sounds like no further questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much for that, Chelsea.
Okay, so so then we move on. Then we move on to actually how the viewpoints that we're proposing would be represented within the tax technical committee. So at the moment, we've outlined a core kind of 6 perspectives or expertise areas that we think are probably important to have based on the conversations we've had and the comments from the board and as well as those from the stakeholder council. So the first is really looking at probably a civil society perspective that brings in more of an advocacy perspective around greater transparency of tax, but also that link to the sustainable development agenda and what information on tax is meaningful to understand those contributions to development. And that is very much in line with points from GSSB members that we really need that link, as well as just the investor perspective, for example. Under business, we certainly think we need to have the representation from a multinational company in the group itself. And at the moment, we've outlined sort of 1 company as being the minimum, and I think what would move that up to 2 is that if we end up with 2 investor perspectives, then we probably also need a second business perspective in terms of just balancing the strength of representation from each of those constituencies. In the investor space, there are a lot of voices out there, a lot of different demands, and we would like to bring in, ideally, a direct investor perspective, so sort of a user of information that companies are reporting, possibly to be accompanied by a second investor perspective that would be from the ratings agency data provider as well as the information user perspective, and that would be someone more like an MSCI or Rebecca Sam, companies that have done quite a lot of information and analysis on tax disclosure and are providing information on tax transparency to investors and other users. But these are, again, this is a little bit, the bigger the group, the more viewpoints represented, but the less flexible the group is as well. In terms of mediating institutions, we'd like to bring in an academic or research perspective on what actually makes tax reporting effective. So we have a couple of contacts that have done research not only on current trends in transparency, but actually how that information is being used and how that also links to these sustainable development trends and measures in different areas. So what is that link that we were discussing a few minutes ago around transparency or taxes paid versus actual development activity in different regions, and how can you ask companies for information that is going to most directly be relevant to understanding those links. We would also certainly want a tax accountant, and we have a couple of potentially good candidates in that area who are coming from private sector or company reporting, but have a detailed understanding of the different methodologies and accounting frameworks around tax. And then the other suggestion that we added in response to comments from the board and also through further discussions with Jürgen leading up to this meeting is a representative from the labor union, and we had very strong feedback that that is necessary to include as a core component to this group. So at the moment, that is 6 to 9 positions that we're putting forward. The maybes, we need to have subsequent conversations over the next 2 weeks to see how strong those maybe viewpoints are and how much they will add to the group dynamic as we've proposed. And again, the only dependency I would call out is that I think if we were inclined to add a second company or a second investor perspective, we would want to balance that out and have 2 in each category. Over to you, Judy, maybe to take questions or comments from the group on whether or not that looks like about the right mix of viewpoints or whether we need to provide additional justification.
Thank you very much. Anyone have any feedback on this? This is a sort of a set of rules of thumb, is it not, Chelsea? Do you propose to put these this composition forward as a kind of hard and fast framework for populating the technical committee, or is it a rule of thumb to help guide the evaluation of potential candidates?
Probably more a rule of thumb. I think this is what we're looking at. These are the kind of perspectives that we think provide the balance that the GSSB just mentioned about being critical in terms of the different perspectives that are potentially competing or certainly sitting at slightly different sides of the table, and the voices that would have to be together in a room to come out with ideally a good compromise. So there might be slight adjustments, but I think those are the kind of rules of thumb that we would be looking at to actually populate names and organizations against that.
Thank you. Okay, any feedback on these categories?
I can see Sulema just raised a question. She has some background noise, so I'll just read it out for you. She's saying,
okay, thank you.
whether, Chelsea, have you considered to include members from the UN committees of expert on international cooperation in tax matters?
No, we have not yet. We had not had a specific suggestion on that, but I'm certainly happy to follow up with you afterwards. So it would be good to understand a bit more the rationale in why UN or government might be particularly applicable. We did speak with OECD, and we had a series of conversations with them around their work with BEPS and others, and they are probably not the right ones to participate in the technical committee because of the fact that their members have very much advocated against public reporting on country-by-country level, but they are very inclined to follow the process and stay in line.
Good. And Stian indicated...
This is Evan. Could I make a comment?
Yes, please go ahead, Evan.
I just wanted to emphasize at the technical committee level, at the outset of this project, the importance of finding great tax accountant expertise. I think that we don't even know, as I look at this topic and talk to companies about it, we don't even know some of the ways in which transparency is being subverted. So I think while we're trying to define the issue and figure out exactly how companies could perhaps become more transparent and effectively disclose, having expertise from that side of the technical committee side, especially in a closed-door meeting, I think would be really effective. So I would advocate for maybe overweighting on that expert side in the committee composition more so at this point. That's just my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. And Stian, did I hear Stian had a comment?
Yes, Judy, I also support the consideration of a government representation on the tax issues. The question is just which one, which government, and there, I will opt for a organization like the OECD as a government representation.
But Stian, the feedback we had is that they're not interested in they cannot participate in this process because of the perceived conflict of interest between public reporting, which is what GRI is seeking to do, and the strong position of OECD members about reporting detailed information to tax authorities, but not publicly. So I think what I would suggest, Judy, is maybe in the interest of time that we follow up on this governmental element with individual GSSB members, and we work to come to a compromise to bring in representation, the right representation, either into this group or in that second larger committee, and then come back maybe to the GSSB via email with an expanded or refined set of viewpoints over the next couple of weeks, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine with me, I think that's a good process recommendation.
Yeah, and just to let you know, Dwight raised a hand as well.
Okay, Dwight, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a few thoughts. In terms of business, I think, first of all, you always want business in all of these committees in the context of these are reporting organizations, and you want to sort of get a perspective on somebody that's actually doing the report. Now, in this particular subject, I think you, in addition to that, you want somebody from business that's familiar with tax issues, and I don't think these two kind of expertises are the same. So if you're going for two from business, and I would recommend that you do, one is from a reporter experience, and one is somebody familiar with the tax issues involved. On the civil society, I think there's probably a similar kind of thing. You're going to want to find some kind of civil society organization that is credible, that works in the area of tax transparency, and because that's you're going to want to have somebody that has that kind of knowledge, and then of course one of the big issues in tax is the relationship of tax to development, and so maybe that's the other second civil society person. But I think in both civil society and business, you sort of need to be focused on the specific expertises beyond those categories. In terms of investors, I don't see a case for a second investor unless, I mean, to have the investor as a information user, I see as important, but I haven't heard a strong argument for a second investor. And then finally, on the mediating institutions, the academic research paper, well, I think that is entirely dependent upon the actual person and the research that person has done. Meaning that if we make a decision to have an academic research person on the theory there might be somebody like that can help, I think you actually have to find the person first and then add them to the group, then to reserve that as a category. That's my own thought. But that's my thought in all those cases. On all the various things that have been proposed, I've shared my thoughts.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much for that, Dwight. Those all good points. Okay, any others?
Kent has a hand up, and then maybe Judy will ask for any further comments to come in offline to me, so that we can make sure we have enough time for the other items on the agenda.
Will do.
I wanted to just second Evan's comment about the need for people on this committee that have technical expertise in the tax area. I think that's part of what Dwight was saying also.
Indeed, yeah, and I think we'll just take this moment to acknowledge that for our own part on the GSSB, that's not an area that we really explicitly have among our own members. So it's important for us to acknowledge the technical complexity of some of the issues that we nevertheless have to be able to look at in order to improve and expand on the GRI standards in the future. This is one example of them. Yes, I would certainly support making sure that we have access to the very best expertise on some of those issues. Taking Chelsea's recommendation, can we then, any further discussion or particular points of follow-up, can we take those offline so that we can now move forward with the rest of our agenda today? Okay, hearing no objections. Thank you very much for all of that, Chelsea. I believe I might be handing this over to Laura now to talk us through the human rights related standards review project proposal. Laura?
Yes, thank you, Judy. Next up is the last of the 3 project proposals for review and approval, which is for the review of the human rights related standards. As with the other 2 projects, we will first look at the changes in the project proposal since the last GSSB discussion and seek to approve the project proposal, and then we will have a short conversation on the composition of the technical committee. So since the last GSSB meeting where we discussed the draft project proposal, we have received a number of comments from the GSSB itself and from the Stakeholder Council and the GRI board, and we have made some slight modifications to the project proposal based on those comments, which we will go through in a moment. But first, I want to briefly summarize the comments from the SC and the board, which you also find in the annex of item 5. So in general, we see a high level of support for this project, and most of the comments that we've got relate to certain things that we should consider or have in mind as we go through the revision project. And then we've received quite a lot of suggestions for specific human rights topics that we should update or review as part of this project. So the first comment that you see here on the slide has to do with the alignment with the UN Guiding Principles and the advice that when we do that, we should apply the same concepts and terminologies as in the UN Guiding Principles, and that we should avoid creating or inventing new concepts or new terminologies. The second comment is about the key instruments with which we should seek to align. So there's consensus and agreement that the guiding principles are the primary instrument that we should seek to align with, but that we should not forget about other key original instruments in this area, such as the ILO core labor standards. Another comment related to harmonization, so in avoiding to add additional reporting burdens for companies, and to the extent possible, seek to align with existing reporting frameworks and reporting requirements. Another comment related to the scope of the content revision. So it's important to not only look at internal policies and practices of an organization with regards to human rights, but to also look at the business operations that are external to the organization. So looking at the supply chain and the market in general. And finally, we got lots of suggestions for specific topics that we should cover in this process. For example, those relating to women's rights, equal opportunity, overtime, fair trial at work, etc. Some of these comments are already covered in some form in the current project proposal. So, for example, supply chain would be covered under the broader concept of business relationships. And there's also a specific reference to harmonization in the text of the project proposal. So we have not implemented or made any further changes to the proposal based on those comments. And similarly, for the suggestions on specific human rights topics, what we propose to do is that we share this directly with the future technical committee for them to consider, but we thought that they were too specific to be called out individually in the project proposal, since we want to leave this element of scoping quite flexible for the technical committee to decide. So with that, the changes that we have made, apologies for the technical difficulties. Let me just go back to the slide that we were looking at. Yeah, so there's been two key changes to the project proposal since last time we discussed this. The first change is in response to a comment from the Stakeholder Council. So in line 108, we have added a reference to other authoritative intergovernmental instruments in addition to the UN Guiding Principles. So that those are the instruments of the UN, the ILO, and the OECD, which are relevant for this topic area. And the second change is in response to a discussion we had at the last GSSB meeting, and it also incorporates written feedback submitted offline after the meeting, and that is to amend the scope to specify that the concept of salience, which was debated at the last meeting, should be explored in the context of conducting due diligence. So conducting due diligence against salient human rights issues, and then to also expand the scope to include situations in which responsibility is created by the relationship of an enterprise to adverse impacts. So looking at different categories of causing, contributing, and being directly linked to an impact. So those are the only two changes in the project proposal. The rest, overarching objectives, scope, the different phases, all of that remains the same as you have seen in the past. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Judy, to seek any comments or questions from the GSSB and to formally approve the project proposal with any changes or amendments the GSSB would like to make.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'd like to open it up for any questions from the GSSB as we seek to approve this project proposal now. None? If there are none, then I think we clearly then have consensus.
Sorry.
Beg your pardon?
We have some hands.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not on the webinar interface today, so I cannot see the hands. Yes, please. Who's first? Is that Sulema?
I believe it was Dwight who raised his hand.
Okay,
Yeah.
And then
fine.
Sulema.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
If you would kindly call on people in turn, then Tina, for me, that would be great. So,
Yeah.
Dwight, please.
Yes. First of all, before I say anything, I can approve of the proposal as it's written, because the first work to be done in this is to clarify certain concepts in this and that. But what I want to do is to just explain what might become something that needs to be clarified in some way, and also it's germane to some of the comments. Now, in the comments that were received from the Stakeholder Council, there were suggestions on specific human rights that needed to be included, and I think that in itself that can be all right, and also in itself it becomes a problem. And here's what I mean. In the guiding principles, there was a decision not to focus on the specific human rights that businesses should pay attention to, but rather to say, look, businesses needed to pay attention to all of the internationally recognized human rights. And so there isn't much in the guiding principles specifying which human rights were particularly important for business to respect. They were supposed to respect all human rights. Now, in the Global Reporting Initiative standards, we have very specific human rights issues that we expect reporting organizations to report on. And I think there's probably nothing wrong with that, provided it doesn't exclude the obligation of businesses to report on all of their salient human rights risks, and then to specify in the form of specific disclosures certain human rights risks. But there needs to be a way to reconcile this difference, and I think there is. But what you don't want to see happen is you don't want to sort of see a sort of nominating which human rights need to be respected and inadvertently saying which human rights don't have to be respected. So I think we have to be very clear that way. So I'm just saying this because I'm just letting people know that there is a potential conceptual difficulty, but there also is a way around that conceptual difficulty. But that would not prevent me from supporting this proposal.
Thank you very much, Dwight. Tina, who's next on the hand raising?
Yeah, then it was Sulema.
Yeah, Laura,
Thank
can
you,
you
Sulema.
go move? Yeah, thank you, Judy. Laura, can you go back to the slide where it's salience? Yes, it's concept of salience should be explored in the context of due diligence. I'm not preventing myself to approve this proposal, but I would take care. I would highlight the need of taking care of the use of concepts and terms, because I'm just checking out in the UN guidance on reporting human rights, and salient human rights is one concept, and the context of due diligence means another thing. So it's just my remark. So I would take care with the use of the terms and concepts, and linking the concepts where it's suitable. This is my remark, the only one.
Thank you, Sulema. This specific wording was suggested by Dwight Justice. Maybe, Dwight, do you want to provide some context as to the wording that we see on the screen?
Yeah, first of all, what we're doing in a proposal is to create a committee of experts to, among other things, see what can be done to bring the GRI reporting standards in line with the UN guiding principles. Now, the issue here is this committee should deal with the concept of salience and decide whether it's important to incorporate and how it relates to due diligence. Salience isn't in the guiding principles, it's in the interpretive guide, which is an authoritative guide to the guiding principles.
Yes.
And the basic idea is that, and the basic idea is, if you're going to conduct due diligence, then what do you conduct due diligence for? Meaning, due diligence is not a abstract concept. At the end of the day, due diligence is a process that is directed at a specific adverse impact. So, if you don't have any idea of what the adverse impact might be, then you really can't conduct due diligence against it. So salience are the things, the kind of adverse human rights impacts that stand out in a given activity, and therefore stuff where you ought to consider conducting due diligence against. So just to use a very popular example, if you were, say, sourcing clothing from Bangladesh, then it might be the fire safety of the factories in which the clothing is made that constitutes the salient human rights risk that against which you must conduct due diligence. So salience is not. It's not the same thing by any means, but in terms of concepts, it's very similar to materiality. Materiality is something that you report because it's material to the purpose of the report. In short, its exclusion would be would not be lead to a true and accurate report. Well, salience is similar notion with respect to due diligence. It isn't due diligence if you avoid conducting due diligence against things that are likely to be that would be likely to be adverse impacts. You're not really conducting due diligence. So saliency is related to due diligence in an analogous way to materiality and reporting. But anyway, I think that this is worth the technical committee talking about. I don't think we should prejudice the discussion by saying, well, we don't want to discuss saliency. I think saliency might be a very useful and helpful idea for human rights reporting.
It is, Dwight. I do agree with you. My main point here is to avoid confusion. So the due diligence is the process. The concept of salient human rights drives the giving priority to the business to take action to prevent negative impacts. This is my point. I do agree with you, but we are trying to establish a way to guide companies to better report on their human rights impact. So this is why I'm being a little bit annoying in terms of concepts and terms. So the concept of salient human rights, it's more related with the how to guide business to take action in terms to avoid and to remediate negative impacts. And the due diligence is the process where the company can put in place to identify where they are causing negative impacts. This is my point. But I do agree with you. It's about how to implement the UN guiding on business and human rights.
Okay, thank you very much. We are running low on time at the moment, and I'm keen that we get through the rest of our agenda today. So, Tina, can you tell me your hands raised on this topic?
Yes, I can just, there is a comment from Nankumar that I'll just try to read up as he's in a public location. But he would like to flag that human rights consultation should be broader, not just limited approach to human rights. So the technical committee should review human rights across geographical locations because there are many different challenges to human rights in these locations. And further, he advised that the revised standards should encourage organizations to report rather than shy away from reporting on human rights.
Thank you. Okay. Very good points. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, it's Robin. I'm on the phone, so I can't sort of put my hand up. But I just had two quick things. One thing just to clarify in the paper. We're looking at appointing a technical committee for phase 1, but phase 2 may be a different technical committee or perhaps even a working group, and that decision will be made subsequently in terms of when the actual topic standards are reviewed.
Yes.
So I just wanted to clarify that that's still the case. And the second thing was if we could ask the technical committee to consider how international humanitarian law is perhaps considered as part of their discussions and their scope as well. I think there's some interest in this part of the world in that interface with conflict areas and companies and reporters who are operating in those environments and how they might sort of report on their responses and the things they're doing. I think there are some references in the current standards to supporting documents that the UNGC and PRI developed, but they're more than 5 or 6 years old, I think. So I think it might be a timely opportunity to look at to what extent this project includes a consideration of humanitarian law as well.
Thank you very much. Laura, do you want to respond to the first point that had to do with the phase 1 versus phase 2 sort of process differences?
Yes, sure. And so phase 2 is quite open and flexible at the moment because that will depend largely on the recommendations of the technical committee during phase 1. So once we get a full set of recommendations from the technical committee, then we will be at a point where we can actually think about phase 2, what that entails, what are the standards that should be reviewed, and how are we going to go about those reviews by either convening technical committees or project working groups. Does that answer your question, Robin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for all of your comments and assistance on this topic. Laura, I believe it does seem to me that we have consensus on the approval of the project proposal, subject to all of the kind of helpful remarks and guidance and caveats that have been raised by the GSSB on this. Would you like to move us ahead with the rest of the discussion of this?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So next, we want to spend a few minutes discussing the proposed composition or viewpoints for the technical committee for phase 1 of this project. First, we wanted to share the suggestions that we have received from the SC and the board in terms of specific experts or organizations that would be relevant to have in the technical committee. So you can see the list of organizations here on the screen. So it includes the Danish Institute for Human Rights, a former member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the ITUC, TUAC, the ILO, union-related organizations focusing on labor rights, and human rights NGOs like the Human Rights Watch. So all of these suggestions are in addition to suggestions we have already received from individual GSSB members, and in addition to the many experts and stakeholders that we already have in GRI's network and with whom we have already spoken during the initial stages of this project. So as with tax, we are likely going to have more experts and interested stakeholders that we will be able to accommodate in a small technical committee. So similarly as with tax, we would propose to keep the technical committee relatively small and focused with a maximum of 8 experts and to engage with a broader network of issue experts and parties ahead of any public comment period. For the technical committee, in terms of process, we would propose to follow the same process that we presented earlier as with tax, with the remarks that you made earlier. And for the viewpoints that we would like to propose for this technical committee, you can see them up on the screen. So we would have in total 8 different seats allocated across the different constituencies of the GSSB. So for the first category on mediating institutions, we would look to have 3 seats. 2 would be for experts on the UN guiding principles, and that could be experts who were part of the development of the guiding principles or who are now concerned with the implementation and update of the principles. And here, the ideal scenario would be to have an official representative at the UN, as well as an independent expert on the guiding principles. And the last a third seat would go to a due diligence expert, and here we would look at experts who are now applying the concept of due diligence in a more holistic way, so looking at human rights, but also at other areas of sustainable development. Then for the business category, we would have 2 seats, one for an international business organization, and we know a few who have been very active in the development and consultations around the UN Guiding Principles, and the other one would be for a multinational company, a company who is leading in terms of human rights reporting. Then in the category of affected stakeholders, we would have one representative from a trade union and one representative from a civil society organization. And finally, one representative from information users or investors. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Judy, to get any comments on the viewpoints that we have presented and whether we are perhaps missing any critical perspectives and whether there is general agreement with the approach proposed to keep the technical committee relatively small and to engage with a broader set of stakeholders through different means.
Thank you, Laura. Any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns about the suggested technical committee composition?
Yes, Judy. Sulema and Wright has raised their hands.
Okay, Sulema.
I promise I will be very brief. I strongly recommend to replace affected stakeholders for right holders. Because we are not using affected stakeholders anymore in terms of human rights. And
yeah, and thank you very much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
These information users, I would like to know if there's no time during this call more about the profile of information users, because it's information user investor, but there are other types of information used in terms of human rights than investors.
Yeah. Okay.
Excuse me, Judy. My last point is in the category of right holders. I'm missing indigenous people representative.
Okay. Thank you. In the interest of getting all of the comments out onto the table, why don't we take all of the points that people are raising their hands around now, and then we can see what further discussion we can have around those. So, Dwight?
Yeah, first of all, I would agree with that last point Sulema made about the information users. Now, it is true that the largest users of reports would seem to be investors and people wanting information about a particular company. But I think there are cases where human rights information would be of interest to other parties who might read GRI reports. And so I don't think we should automatically and always assume that an information user is going to be a potential investor or something like that. That's the first point. The second point is with regard to business and stakeholders. I think that expertise with the or deep familiarity with the UN guiding principles needs to be a criterion for those categories as well. I don't think it's enough to have somebody from a union and a business and civil society. For the purposes of this committee, these individuals also have to be very familiar with the guiding principles. I don't think there needs to be a sort of clear majority within the technical group of people that are familiar with the guiding principles if its recommendation is to make sense. So I think that's very important. And that would be true. Then the other thing I was thinking of is in addition to unions, you have you have a lot of affected stakeholders in the forms of NGOs that speak out on behalf of the abuses of the mining industry or supply chains or civil and political rights within respective countries. And I'm a little worried if you just have one civil society, because it might be that there needs to be a little broader scope in terms of that dimension to the committee, because you have many different kinds of rights. You have economic and social rights and civil and political rights, and I'm not sure that one civil society organization is enough. But it's just a question. But anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other comments waiting to be made in the wings, Tina?
Evan is writing at the moment, but else there's none. Sorry, and it just came through. Evan is saying he is agreeing with Dwight that civil society might need overweight representation in this committee.
Okay, all right.
Judy, we might ask, similar to the previous project, that any additional thoughts or suggestions on technical committee membership goes to Lara offline, and then we will consolidate both of those and share back with the group.
Yeah, agreed. This is a sort of statement of principle that we're looking at here, and of course all of it has to make sense in the context of the actual individuals and the tasks that we're asking them to do as a group. So I thank the GSSB for all of their recommendations and thoughts around this composition, and look forward to what the standards division can bring back to us next time. So can we move on then? Anna and Laura, would you like to update us on the work of the water and occupational health and safety working groups, please?
Sure. Chelsea is going to kick this off, so I'll turn it over to her first.
Thank you.
Sure. Next slide, guys. So just to give you guys a very quick overview, because we are short on time, we'll probably focus about 10 minutes on water as being probably the most relevant, because we've just had our 2-day workshop. We are tracking on timelines with both of these projects. They are on quite ambitious timelines, and the team has been working really hard to run an excellent series of meetings with both working groups. We had water in town in Amsterdam Thursday, Friday last week. We are now writing up the first cut of the draft standard coming out of that meeting. We had Nan Kumar there as well, and we will be hosting in Amsterdam next week our health and safety experts on Tuesday and Wednesday. So you will see a first draft, basically, which will be still quite rough, but of the emerging standards ahead of the 29th of June GSSB meeting. And we're really going to ask GSSB members to use that as a first indication of content changes that are coming out of these working groups, and we will try our best to represent the rationale behind those content changes for you. I would say there's a lot of really good dialogue and thought process going on in both groups that we hope to be representing adequately back to the board. At the moment, we're looking at sharing a final public comment draft with the GSSB on 5th of July, which would be ahead of our sign-off call at the end of July. So quite a lot of work for the team still over the next couple of months. What that means in terms of timeline is that we are going to revisit a discussion we had in January, where we will be looking to ask the GSSB to agree with a proposed shorter public comment period. Rather than 90-day public comment period, we are proposing a 60-day comment period from approximately the 10th of August till 10th of October. And that is, of course, conditional on the fact that the board feels comfortable with the content coming out of these workshops. But if we are able to meet those timelines with the board in July, then what this would allow us to do is to wrap up the work of those working groups in the calendar year. so that they would have a solid 2 months to review and make changes to the drafts after the comment period, and then we could be looking at GSSB approval in early 2018 of the final drafts. But otherwise, if we run the comment period to 90 days, we have to break the work of the project working groups over the holiday season and reconvene them for final meetings in the early part of the calendar year next year, and we feel that will be a more challenging process for us and also for their time. So I would just turn that over to you, Judy. I know at the beginning of the year we had a general indication that the GSSB felt comfortable with a shorter public comment period, given that there's probably not more than 20 pages of content emerging from both of these projects. But we just wanted to reconfirm that with the board before we go ahead with kind of moving along those expected timelines, subject to change, of course.
Thank you very much. So the question is the GSSB comfortable with a 60-day public comment period? Any feedback on this from the GSSB?
Sounds fine.
I support that.
Okay, I can't see anything in the chat function, so if there are any hands raised, please let me know. But so far we've only heard support, that the GSSB is in fact comfortable with a 60-day public comment period. Any further?
Only positive comments in the chat, Judy.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, I mean 60 days is still 2 months. That's not bad, I think, and that should be a reasonable amount of time to publicize and allow the proposal to percolate through the user groups and stakeholders and so forth. So I think we have consensus on that, Chelsea.
That's great.
That a 60-day public comment period will go ahead with those 2 groups.
All right, excellent. I will turn it over now to Anna just to take you briefly through some high-level outcomes coming from the water workshop last week.
Thank you, Chelsea. Before I start, I would like to give a very just quick personal note that indeed the meeting of the project working group on water was very productive and very informative, and we have seen sincere enthusiasm from experts to develop the standard in such a way that would help the companies take the next step in understanding and reporting their water impacts and their response to these impacts. And the project working group has reiterated many times to us during these 2 days that they see the strength and distinction of the GRI standard in its structure, that it has a few concise but very key meaningful metrics, and they kept returning themselves to this point throughout their discussions, and we sailed through a lot of content, but that this helped them keep the focus on discussing only the very essential content that needs to get into the standard, and thinking that content through instead of throwing everything in one bucket and then leaving it without a clear outcome. So we're very happy and satisfied with the outcomes. All right, so let me just give you the rationale behind some of the disclosures and content that you will see in the draft standard that you will receive in a few weeks. So the key thing that we need to ground our disclosures on, the disclosures that we develop, is the consideration of the local context of and the nature of water issues. So unlike the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, water is a very local issue where water withdrawal, consumption, and pollution have an impact only in the basin in which they occur. This is why any information that we request has to account for the environmental, social, and economic needs of that particular basin. Secondly, it seems that companies only look at the consequences of their water use on the water availability, but not on water quality. For example, the apparel sector, or the water impacts of the apparel sector, are largely water pollution. So this has to be accounted for when we develop disclosures. It is critical to preserve the water basins and the water bodies that companies take water from and discharge water into. And we need to know, aside knowing how companies impact these basins, we need to know what are they doing to improve the future conditions of these water basins. And this is why we want to focus disclosures on asking both for negative and positive impacts of companies on the river basins and to understand what are they doing in their management approach from this perspective as well. Next is a very important point that we want to, that in asking any quantitative information, we want the companies to report and explain the thought process behind reporting this information, because we need to be sure that the numbers that they submit, that they understand the link between the numbers that they submit with the impact that these numbers have, and also we need to be sure that the way they collect these numbers is sensible. And what I mean is that we need to understand that they're using credible tools to measure these numbers, credible frameworks, methodologies, etc. Also, we have realized that for many of the topics, it will not be possible to develop disclosures that allow comparable information. And so we will be asking, in many instances, the companies just to explain how they have calculated this number, and this will give us some indication of whether this is a trustworthy number or not. And finally, coming back to point 2 on the slide, that we need to account for water pollution just as much as we need to account for water availability in the basin. And for that matter, we need to look at water quality as a key component to understanding water impacts. And this is why we think it is essential to bring water discharge and effluents in one standards together with water. So to bring that back from 306 to 303. On the next slide, oops, I'm sorry.
Anna, could I ask you to possibly try to pick up the pace just a tiny bit on the report back, because we have only a few minutes left.
I know, yes, I'm trying.
Thank you.
All right, so the key changes from existing GRI 303 and GRI 306. First of all, we need to understand why water is material to an organization, and currently we found there is not enough detail in the standard that asks for this information, and we need to know how the organization interacts with water. What are its major water uses for us to even start to look at the water impacts of an organization. After this, we need to know what the company is doing to address these impacts, and when looking at the targets that the organization sets on water and effluents, we need to understand how the company sets these targets. Again, coming back to my previous point, we need to know that these targets are actually correspond to the existing water issues of the company. For example, the company might set a 50% reduction or 50% increase of water efficiency target in its facilities, but actually the 90% of its water impact is occurring in the supply chain. So we want this connection to be strong and present in the standard. Moving on to the next point, we want companies to report their water impacts in the value chain. So we want them to look beyond the fence line and beyond their direct operations. What we have found is that often their major impact occurs at their tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers, but they don't even look there. So we need to bring that into the standard. We had strong consensus by the project working group that we need to add water consumption to the existing disclosure on water withdrawals, because water consumption is more defining of impact than withdrawal, because it speaks about the water that is not returned to the water body. But more importantly, we need to understand, we need to know the water consumption and withdrawals in water-stressed areas, because once the organization knows the areas it's discharging and drawing water from, then it can define an adequate management approach to in these water-stressed areas. And we would ideally like companies to make that step and move in this direction. And finally, we had a lot of discussion on what metrics we need to develop to measure discharge impacts of an organization. But what we see is that companies are not paying enough attention to their water discharge and are not taking enough actions beyond sort of the basic compliance, and we would like them to move beyond this. So what we need to understand is how much and what kind of wastewater the organizations are discharging, and how is this wastewater affecting the receiving bodies. And we thought that to start this dialogue, we can start this dialogue through asking about their levels of treatment, about how the organizations treat water, do they think it's necessary, etc. So still still metrics to be developed, but this is the general approach that we're moving into, and that you'll see reflected in the updated standard in a month. This is it for me.
So Judy, given the time, this is Chelsea here, I think we will recommend to skip the update on OHS, and we will instead circulate an update to the GSSB via email after we complete the workshop early next week, when we have a bit more detail to share. Judy?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much for that. And I think also, Chelsea, we don't really have time for the summary of technical queries that we distributed under any other business. But I would like to draw the GSSB's attention to these technical queries, because it's important for us to be aware of the questions that are coming in to the standards division about interpretation or application of the standards, and to be aware of whether there is any requirement for further guidance, authoritative pronouncements, or simply ad hoc advice that either we or another GRI-related body ought to be delivering to users on this. I think we probably, in the interest of time, we just need to leave it for this meeting, if that's okay. Okay, well, I think then it remains for me to say thank you very much to everyone for participating today once again on the call. And thank you for all of your efforts in moving us forward on these various project proposals, which, as you know, are very important to our work plan. I look forward to hearing any offline comments or recommendations pertaining to the specific projects that we might be talking about over the coming weeks. And obviously, I'm here, and the Standards Division team are all present, available to talk about any of these topics in the offline period as issues come up. So thank you very much once again for your participation. And with that, I will draw the meeting to a close until the next time. Thank you.